What's up, my comic comrades? With Spider-Man No Way Home officially in the world and changing the Marvel Universe, we thought it would be fun to count down our list of the 10 best Spider-Man stories in comic history to cap off this ultimate Spider-Man weekend. Now, the webhead has been around for a long time, so this list was incredibly hard to narrow down, especially as a massive Spider-Man fan. But as we always point out, these lists are completely subjective. So after you're done seeing our list, let us know what yours would be in the comments of this episode. Anyway, enough chit chat. Let's get started on our list of the 10 greatest Spider-Man stories in history. Off the list is Spiderverse. Now, this is a modern Spider-Man story, but there's no denying how much fun the story was and the sheer impact it had on the Spider-Man mythos on a multiversal scale. The story focuses around Spider-Men and women across the universe, more specifically across the Spiderverse, to combat one of the most evil and terrifying Spider-Man villains ever, Morlun and his family. His family are known as the Inheritors, and they just want to suck the life force of every version of Spider-Man in the multiverse/Spiderverse. It's one of those massive crossover events that's done very well because, let's face it, huge comic crossover events are usually just okay or a letdown, but then you get gems like this, which are epic. And it was epic seeing the main 616 Peter Parker team up with Spider-Gwen, Spider-Man 2099, Spider-Man Noir, Superior Spider-Man, Miles Morales Spider-Man, Silk, Spider-Ham, and so on. To drive my point home, this story is so good it's responsible for us getting arguably the best Spider-Man movie to date, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. If you want to know more about the Spider-Verse story, just check out our complete summary of the story right here. Next up on the list is the original Sinister Six story, which took place in the Amazing Spider-Man Annual 1 from 1964. This story holds a special place in my heart because it's one of the first Spider-Man stories I ever read. I remember reading it as an omnibus when I was like 10 or 11 at Barnes & Noble's while my dad was reading in the cafe. And it just stuck with me because one, it's a really good story, but two, as a kid, I was like, they're taking 6 of Spider-Man's biggest villains and forming them into a team to fight the Wall Crawler. That's amazing. In any case, I'm sure many Spider-Man fans are familiar with the story. If not, we did an origin of the Sinister Six episode you could check out right here. With that said, this story is exactly what it implies, the Sinister Six fighting Spider-Man, except this is the first time it ever happened. You see, Dr. Octopus was fed up with Spider-Man beating him, so we got an idea, which basically was that if he combined with 5 more of Spider-Man's greatest foes, and each of them fight him one at a time, it would slowly wear him down until one of them defeats him. The team originally consisted of Vulture, Electro, Mysterio, Kraven, Sandman, and their leader, Dr. Octopus. Plain and simple, it's just an iconic fun classic Stan Lee and Steve Ditko Spider-Man read that gives us the origin of what would become one of the most iconic villain teams in all of comics. Coming in at number 8 is the death of Jean DeWolff in Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man issues 107 through 110. This is a story you would probably see on many other top 10 Spider-Man stories, and that's because it's widely considered to be just that. It's one of the handful of darker, more violent themed Spider-Man stories, kind of in the vein of Frank Miller's Daredevil. It deals with the death of police captain Jean DeWolff. She was a title character for years and was a reluctant ally to Spider-Man. It's essentially a murder mystery story with a pretty big twist, and you guys know I love murder mysteries, as my own comic book Astonishing Times is also a superhero murder mystery. So it's not shocking that the story has made it on our list, as it's inspired many other creators like myself since its release. Anyway, the death of Jean DeWolff has become such a staple for Spider-Man fans that writer Nick Spencer actually expanded upon the story with a certain character or villain that he was writing, but no spoilers here. Coming in at number 7 is one that might be a little higher on other people's list, and that would be the Master Planner Saga. A big reason why this is on our list is because, simply put, it's kind of the embodiment of what makes Spider-Man such a great hero. It is a classic Stan Lee and Steve Ditko story that builds up Spider-Man's mythos while showing us why he's one of the best superheroes ever created. For example, throughout the story, we see Peter use his skills as both himself and the Spider-Man persona to save the day. In one instance, while Spider-Man is seemingly defeated, trapped under tons of fallen steel, he says, "I failed. Just now when it counted the most, I failed. But I can't give up. I must keep trying. I must." Spider-Man then tries to lift the steel off of him, but he can't do it. He's too exhausted from all the fighting he did before he got to this point. Then right as he's about to give up, he thinks of Aunt May and Uncle Ben, saying the only thing that'll save Aunt May is that serum, and if I can't bring it to her, if she doesn't make it, it'll be my fault. Just the way I always blame myself for what happened to Uncle Ben. He then pushes himself to lift the tons of steel off of his back in order to save his Aunt May, ultimately saying anyone can win a fight when the odds are easy. It's when the going gets tough, when there seems to be no chance, that's when it counts. And with that, he finally lifts the steel off of his back. There's a lot more to the scene and more dialogue that really drives it home, but the point is, it's easily one of the most iconic moments in Spider-Man's history, so much so, they loosely adapted it at the end of Spider-Man Homecoming. Rounding out the bottom 5, we have the original Goblin Saga. Now, everyone's familiar with the Green Goblin, but when they introduced the Hobgoblin, everyone was like, wait, what? There's a new goblin in town? And the way they did it was genius. It was a mystery at first, before revealing it was Roderick Kingsley. We just saw this mystery man find one of Green Goblin's hideouts, then take all of his gear and tech and modify it to become the Hobgoblin. Nowadays, we are used to getting like 10 different offshoots of Spider-Man characters, but that wasn't the case when this story came out. But I think what made it such a successful and good story was the way it was told, where everything was just a mystery. It's also the story that introduced us to one of the most iconic villains of all time, the Hobgoblin, the character who would become so successful he went on to be one of the villains in the Universal Studios Orlando Spider-Man ride, as well as being voiced by Mark Hamill himself in the 90s Spider-Man animated series. Coming in at number 5, we have the SpiderMan No More story that takes place in the Amazing Spider-Man issues 50 through 52. This is another story that's probably going to be on every top 10 Spider-Man stories list because it's just that good. The story deals with Peter Parker getting fed up with always trying to do the right thing, but still getting the crap end of the stick as the police and public think of him as a menace and villain. That's right, because of J. Jonah Jameson and people like him, Peter finally quit being Spider-Man, leaving his costume inside of a trash can in an alley. This was a massive moment for the character as Peter literally quit being Spider-Man. Ultimately, he would put the costume on again though to stop the Kingpin. The start of the story in Amazing Spider-Man issue 50 is actually the first appearance of the Kingpin, which is another reason why this story is a classic. In any case, the scene where Spider-Man leaves his costume in the trash can has become one of the most iconic images for Spider-Man and even comics in general. So much so, Sam Raimi recreated this image in Spider-Man 2, and it was all kinds of amazing. I know I definitely appreciate it being the massive Spider-Man fan that I am. Number 4 on the list is Superior Spider-Man Volume 1, My Own Worst Enemy. Now, some of you may be shocked that the first volume of Superior Spider-Man is so high on the list. Well, that's simply because it was such a refreshing, good new take on Spider-Man. I just remember everyone being pissed at writer Dan Slott because he killed off Peter Parker and had the dying Dr. Octopus's mind transferred into Peter's body, making him the new Spider-Man, or more specifically, the Superior Spider-Man. But most fans just jumped the gun because there was no way Dan and Marvel were actually going to keep Peter dead forever. In the end, this was actually one of the most interesting takes on the character we've seen in decades. Seeing one of Spider-Man's greatest enemies, Dr. Octopus, as a hero, but not just any hero, as his nemesis Spider-Man, was epic and gave us some of the coolest Spider-Man stories ever, in my opinion. Not to mention the modifications he made to his Spider-Man costume and overall look of the suit was dope. And then just the way it all ends with Peter obviously coming back, becoming Spider-Man once more with Otto supposedly dying. So good. Read the first volume, My Own Worst Enemy, obviously, but also read the whole freaking series. Making its way to the top 3 is a no-duh, and that would be Amazing Fantasy 15, the first appearance and origin of Spider-Man. Plain and simple, this is the comic book that started it all. Without this story and issue, Spider-Man would not exist, meaning none of the stories previously mentioned would exist either. Besides that, it's just very well done, which is why this issue led to the popularity of the character, because out the gate, people were like, yeah, this is kind of awesome. Lee and Ditko gave us a superhero that was something like we never seen up until that point. A teenager who had pimples, no money, and the farthest thing from a ladies' man. You gotta remember, prior to this, most superheroes were older dudes who had all the ladies and had huge muscles, you know, the stereotype. But Stan Lee wanted to create a character that broke the mold, making the teenager not the sidekick, but rather the main hero, and just give him normal everyday life problems like most of us, making him super relatable. Mix that with awesome powers, a dope looking costume, and you have one of the most successful superheroes ever created. Coming in runner-up, we have the night Gwen Stacy died in the Amazing Spider-Man issues 121 and 122. Now, I don't think I have to justify why this Spider-Man story is so high on our list. This would actually be a solid number 1 pick, but it landed at number 2 for us. Either way, not only is this comic one of the most iconic Spider-Man stories ever, this is one of the most popular comic book stories ever, and that's not even an opinion. It's a fact. As the title of the story implies, it deals with Green Goblin killing Spider-Man's first true love, Gwen Stacy. And as we know, Green Goblin would infamously kidnap Gwen Stacy and throw her off the Brooklyn Bridge. Spider-Man tried to save her with one of his web lines, but the sudden stop in momentum caused her neck to snap, as indicated by a caption in the comic. It's easily one of the most well-known deaths in comic book history, up there with the death of Batman's parents. It's such a tragic yet well-known story, and it cements the fact that Green Goblin is Spider-Man's ultimate arch nemesis. The story is also credited for the beginning of the darker, grittier Bronze Age of comics, because if I didn't mention it already, this was a very dark and gritty story, especially within a Spider-Man comic. And here's a fun fact: Stan Lee didn't even know that writer Jerry Conway was gonna kill Gwen Stacy. To go even further, he didn't want Gwen Stacy to die. He was on vacation in Europe and found out after it already happened. But either way, it gave us one of the best and most iconic Spider-Man stories ever. And coming in at number 1 is Kraven's Last Hunt. Now this is a story that deserves to be on any top 10 Spider-Man story list. But I have a feeling you won't find it at number 1. But for us, this is a Spider-Man story like no other. First and foremost, I remember when I first read this story back in the 90s thinking, whoa, this is a really dark Spider-Man story. It's almost like Spider-Man goes Batman in tone. And as a side note, that actually makes sense because this story was originally pitched to be a Batman story, which is probably why I love the story so much. Some of my favorite Spider-Man stories are the darker ones. Now, a big reason why this story is so awesome is because how the ending is nailed perfectly. As many of us know, it's so hard to nail the ending of any story, whether it's a TV show, movie, or comic book. And J.M. DeMatteis and Mike Zeck really stuck the landing with this one. It's a story that crosses over into several Spider-Man titles and shows us Kraven going after his ultimate goal of killing Spider-Man, which he succeeds in doing, or so it seems. But once he kills Spider-Man and buries him, he takes on the Spider-Man mantle himself, learning what it's like to be Spider-Man. And adding to the coolness, this all happened while Spider-Man was wearing his epic black costume. Again, the tone of the story, the pacing, the writing, the twist, and the excellent ending for me make this the perfect Spider-Man story. It's near and dear to my heart, and I know it's a highly loved Spider-Man story in general. So for all those reasons, it's number 1 on our list. But there you have it, friends, our top 10 Spider-Man stories. Make sure you let us know what you think of our list and what your favorite Spider-Man stories are down in the comments. And that's gonna bring today's episode to a close. But if you like today's Spider-Man themed episode, check out this one right here. And if you like all of our content, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. It always helps the channel out. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time when I talk about all things comics.